The sterile scent of antiseptic stung Amelia Carson's nostrils, each breath a sharp reminder of why she was here. Her trembling hands, slick with nervous sweat, wrestled with the pen as she clutched the clipboard. Hayes Women's Health Clinic felt less like a place of healing and more like a high-tech torture chamber, despite the calming lavender scent and muted jazz. Amelia hated this, the vulnerability, the anticipation. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she scanned the intake form. Name, date of birth, medical history. Simple questions, yet her mind was a chaotic storm, each thought colliding with the last. "Just fill out the form, Amelia," she muttered, her voice a shaky whisper. "It's not that hard." But it was hard. For years, she had meticulously avoided this moment, convincing herself she was fine. But weeks of gnawing discomfort, coupled with late-night Google searches that spiraled into terrifying possibilities, had broken her resolve. The receptionist, with an unnervingly cheerful smile, had highly recommended Dr. Ethan Hayes, one of the best in the city. At the time, he was just a name, a doctor. Nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The nurse's voice cut through the anxious haze. "Amelia Carson?" Amelia jolted, nearly dropping the clipboard. It was as if she'd been summoned to her execution. Swallowing hard, she clutched the form like a lifeline, her knuckles white. With legs that felt like jelly, she followed the nurse down a long, echoing hallway. Each closed exam room was a silent threat, the antiseptic smell growing stronger, more suffocating. "You can have a seat," the nurse said, her smile practiced but devoid of warmth, gesturing to a chair inside a small office. "Dr. Hayes will be in shortly." Amelia nodded, her breath shallow and ragged. She sat down stiffly, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers throbbed. The room was impeccably organized, framed certificates that spoke of years of dedication, a sleek desk devoid of clutter, and, in the corner, the dreaded exam chair, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light like a metallic predator. She tried to look away, but her gaze was magnetically drawn back. Her fingers twisted together, a silent plea for courage. "Be calm," she whispered to herself. "Be normal. Just get through this." Then, the door swung open, and Amelia forgot how to breathe altogether. The man who walked in defied every expectation. Dr. Ethan Hayes was breathtaking. Tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed an effortless charisma that crackled in the air. His dark hair was artfully tousled, framing a jawline sharp enough to cut diamonds. And his eyes were a startling, mesmerizing blue, holding an easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wasn't supposed to look like this. Amelia's mouth went dry. "Miss Carson," his voice was a smooth, warm baritone, completely professional yet laced with a hint of something else, amusement. He offered a reassuring smile as he closed the door behind him, trapping her. Amelia tried to respond, but her vocal cords seemed paralyzed. She was too busy battling a full-blown panic attack. He was young. He was attractive. And he was going to examine her. Oh God, oh no. Ethan sat down across from her, his movements fluid and graceful, flipping through her file. "I see this is your first visit to a gynecologist." Amelia nodded, the movement so abrupt it threatened to dislodge her head. Ethan's smile remained gentle, but now it held a knowing glint. "I know this can be nerve-wracking," he said, his voice softer, more intimate. "But I promise we'll take things at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're comfortable." She nodded again, cheeks burning with a blush that spread like wildfire down her neck. Ethan noticed. He noticed the way she tensed, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she looked like she wanted to disappear into the very fabric of the chair. She was different from the usual parade of patients he saw, shy, timid, fragile in a way that resonated deep within him, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. He leaned forward slightly, his tone even softer, almost coaxing. "How are you feeling, Amelia?" Amelia clenched her hands even tighter. "Fine," she lied, the word barely audible. Ethan chuckled, a warm, easy sound that sent shivers down her spine despite herself. "You don't have to be nervous. I promise I'm not that scary. Amelia begged to differ. He was terrifying, not because of who he was, but because of what he was making her feel. She had never reacted to anyone like this. Her heart was a frantic drum solo, her palms were slick with sweat, and her body was screamingly aware of his every move, every breath. And the worst part? Ethan noticed. Ethan noticed her body language, the way she avoided his gaze, the delicate pink flush that painted her cheeks. He saw the vulnerability lurking behind her wide, hesitant eyes. She was adorable. Ethan had met thousands of patients, confident ones, nervous ones, even some who flirted shamelessly. But Amelia was different. Her fragility sparked an unexpected protectiveness within him, a desire to shield her from everything, including himself. That was a dangerous thought. He cleared his throat, pushing those traitorous feelings aside. Focus, Ethan, he chided himself internally. You're her doctor, not some guy in a bar. Before we begin, he said, striving to keep his voice light and professional, do you have any questions for me? Amelia hesitated, a maelstrom of questions swirling within her. But every single one died in her throat, choked by anxiety. So, she just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the floor. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden behind her silence. Then, he smiled again, a slow, captivating curve of his lips that made her stomach flip. All right, he said, his voice laced with a warmth that made her knees weak. Let's get started. And Amelia knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was going to be the longest, most excruciating appointment of her life. Amelia practically sprinted out of the clinic that day, the automatic doors sighing closed behind her like a collective sigh of relief. Her heart still hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she navigated the crowded sidewalk. Her hands were clammy, her cheeks burned with mortification, and her brain was still reeling from the encounter. She had never felt so out of place, so awkward, so utterly exposed in her entire life. Dr. Ethan Hayes was too much. Too handsome, too charming, too intimidating. And the worst part? He had been kind, gentle, understanding, which somehow made things even worse. Because that meant she couldn't even be mad at him. She was mad at herself, mad at the way her stomach had cartwheeled when he spoke to her, mad at the way her skin had tingled when he reached out to shake her hand, mad at the way she had nearly melted into a puddle of humiliation just from looking at him. I can never go back, she vowed, her voice a strained whisper lost in the city's cacophony. Not in a million years. But fate, as it so often did, had other, more mischievous plans. For the next 2 weeks, Amelia ruthlessly ignored every call from the clinic. Her prescription needed to be adjusted? Didn't care. She needed to schedule a follow-up appointment? Not happening. She was a master of avoidance, a champion of denial. But then, her symptoms started getting worse, a persistent, nagging discomfort that refused to be ignored. And no amount of avoiding the problem was going to make it go away. Which was how, with a profound sense of impending doom, she found herself back in that same pristine waiting room, gripping the arms of the chair like a desperate castaway clinging to driftwood. This time, she silently prayed for a different doctor. Someone older, someone boring, someone who wouldn't make her entire brain short-circuit. But of course, life hated her. Because the moment the nurse called her name and led her back to the dreaded office, the person waiting for her was, once again, him. Dr. Ethan Hayes, looking as unfairly good as ever. He glanced up from her file as she stepped inside, his expression a carefully neutral mask. Then, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face, sending a fresh wave of heat crashing over her. Amelia, he said, closing the folder with a soft thud. I was starting to think you were avoiding me. Her breath hitched, caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Her stomach twisted into knots. She quickly took a seat, keeping her gaze glued to the intricate pattern of the rug. I wasn't, she stammered, the lie a pathetic whisper. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk, his expression gentle, amused, but also undeniably curious. You missed your follow-up, he said, his voice soft, almost teasing. And when we tried calling, you didn't answer. Amelia felt like she was slowly dying, each word a nail hammered into her coffin. I got busy, she mumbled, the excuse weak and unconvincing. Ethan didn't believe her for a second, but he let it slide. Instead, he studied her carefully, noticing the way she kept fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, the way her shoulders were rigid, her body tense. She was nervous, almost visibly vibrating with anxiety. She had been nervous last time too, but this was different, amplified. And somehow, knowing that, witnessing her vulnerability, made something inside him soften, a protective instinct kicking in. He had seen thousands of patients, but none like Amelia Carson. There was something about her, something delicate, something real, that made him want to be careful, to move slowly, to make sure she felt safe. And that was a strange, unwelcome feeling, a feeling he hadn't anticipated. Amelia, meanwhile, was fighting a desperate battle against a full-blown panic attack. Every second in this room felt like torture, a slow, agonizing burn. She knew he was just doing his job, that he wasn't thinking about this the way she was. But it didn't matter. She had to get out of here, as soon as possible. So, the moment the appointment ended, she practically bolted for the door, mumbling a barely audible thank you as she disappeared down the hallway. And Ethan, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, felt a sharp pang of disappointment as he watched her go. He didn't expect to see her again so soon, not outside the sterile confines of the clinic, not in a completely different setting. But a few days later, as he stepped into his favorite cafe to grab a coffee before heading to work, his eyes landed on a familiar figure sitting by the window, bathed in the soft morning light. Amelia. She hadn't seen him yet. She was completely engrossed in the novel propped open in front of her, occasionally tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips slightly parted as she devoured the words. She looked peaceful, almost serene, a world away from the anxious, flustered woman he usually saw. And for some reason, that made Ethan hesitate. Because suddenly, she wasn't just a patient, a file number, a medical chart. She was someone he wanted to know, not just in a clinical setting, not just as a name on a piece of paper, but as a person. As Amelia. He took a deep breath, steeling his resolve. Then, he walked over to her table, his footsteps deliberately soft. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, leaning slightly against the table, his voice a low rumble that sent a jolt of electricity through her. Amelia froze mid-sip, her eyes going wide with shock. For a moment, she just stared at him, her brain struggling to process the unexpected intrusion. Then, she choked on her coffee, sputtering and coughing, her cheeks flushing crimson. Ethan tried not to laugh, but a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Amelia wanted to die. Because for the second time in a row, Dr. Ethan Hayes had completely caught her off guard, shattering her carefully constructed defenses. Amelia gripped her coffee cup tightly, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm from the surprise of seeing Dr. Ethan Hayes outside his clinic. She had barely recovered from her last encounter, and now here he was, standing in front of her, impossibly composed, his sharp blue eyes glinting with amusement. Hi," she stammered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of coffee on her skin. Ethan chuckled, the sound warm and genuine, and slid into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I had no idea you came here," he said, glancing around the cafe with a casual air. "This is my usual spot." Amelia swallowed hard, trying to quell the rising tide of panic. This was not where she expected to see him again, outside of a medical setting, just casually sitting across from her like this was normal. I like the quiet," she mumbled, hoping he wouldn't notice how ridiculously nervous she was. Ethan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Me too." And just like that, an easy silence settled between them, a comfortable stillness that filled the space. For the first time, Amelia allowed herself to look at him, really look at him. He was wearing a tailored dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, tanned forearms. His watch looked impossibly expensive, a subtle but unmistakable symbol of wealth. His entire presence exuded an effortless polish, a quiet confidence that spoke of privilege and power. He looked like someone who belonged to a completely different world than hers, a world of luxury and ease. And yet, here he was, sitting across from her, looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. That thought terrified her. A few days later, Amelia's world tilted on its axis once again. She was absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from the persistent ache in her chest, when she stumbled upon an article that made her stomach drop like a stone. Dr. Ethan Hayes, the millionaire doctor behind Hayes Medical Group. She froze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She clicked on the article, her eyes widening with each passing word, each staggering revelation. Ethan wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor, a leading name in gynecology, a pioneer in women's health, with multiple hospitals under his name, including the very clinic she had visited. And on top of that, he was filthy rich, a multimillionaire with a lifestyle that was completely and utterly inaccessible to her. Amelia could barely breathe. It wasn't just that he was successful, it was the sheer scale of his wealth and influence, the vast chasm that separated their lives. She had been so naive, so foolish. She had let herself believe, for even a fleeting second, that he was just a normal person, a regular guy. But now, the cold, hard truth was staring her right in the face. Ethan Hayes wasn't just some charming doctor. He was untouchable, a god amongst mortals. And she was just Amelia Carson, an ordinary girl with an ordinary life, struggling to pay her rent, trying to figure things out one day at a time. They weren't equals. They weren't even close. And the sooner she accepted that, the better. Ethan started noticing the change immediately. Amelia was avoiding him, a subtle but undeniable shift in her behavior. At first, he thought he was imagining it, that he was being paranoid. But then, she started ignoring his texts, offering flimsy excuses for why she couldn't meet him. She stopped coming to the cafe, her usual table conspicuously empty. She missed her follow-up appointment again, this time without even bothering to call. And suddenly, a chilling realization dawned on him: he might lose her before he even had a chance to figure out what this was between them. That was unacceptable. So, one evening, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He found her. Amelia had just finished her shift at the bookstore where she worked, her bag slung over her shoulder, her face etched with exhaustion. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the cool night air, he was there, leaning against his sleek black car, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Ethan," she choked out, her voice barely audible. His gaze never wavered. "Are you avoiding me?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something beneath it, a note of steel, a hint of vulnerability that she had never heard before. Amelia looked away, her gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. "No," she lied, the word a pathetic whisper. "I've just been busy." Ethan exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if trying to control his rising frustration. He pushed himself off the car, stepping closer to her, his presence filling her space, making it hard to breathe. "Amelia," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Don't lie to me." She clenched her fists, digging her fingernails into her palms. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. You're you, and I'm me. We're from completely different worlds, Ethan." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I don't want to be someone people think is chasing after you for your money." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he laughed, a short, incredulous sound that echoed in the night. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't cruel, but it was genuine disbelief, laced with a hint of amusement. Amelia felt her cheeks heat with shame and anger. "Why are you laughing?" Ethan shook his head, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a strange mix of tenderness and frustration. "Because, Amelia," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her, "I think you're the first person in my life who's ever run away from me because of my money." Amelia's lips parted in surprise, but she had no words. Because for the first time, she saw it, the truth behind the carefully constructed facade. The exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the way he looked at her, not as a doctor, not as a millionaire, but as a man who was simply trying to understand her, a man who was just as vulnerable, just as scared as she was. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure about running anymore. Amelia tried everything to keep her distance from Ethan. She avoided the cafe, taking a different route to work each day. She turned down his invitations, politely at first, then more firmly, offering a series of increasingly implausible excuses. She ignored the texts he sent, checking up on her, making sure she was okay, even though each one made her heart ache with guilt and longing. But no matter how hard she tried to shut him out, to erase him from her thoughts, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: herself. Because every time she saw his name flash across her phone, her fingers itched to respond, to hear his voice, to feel that connection again. Because every time she walked past the clinic, she had to force herself not to look inside, not to catch a glimpse of him, not to succumb to the irresistible pull he exerted on her. Because every time she closed her eyes at night, she saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his presence, and the memory was so vivid, so real, that it left her breathless with longing. And that terrified her. Because Ethan Hayes wasn't just someone she could fall for. He was someone she could lose herself in, someone who had the power to completely unravel her carefully constructed life. And that was even scarier than the idea of him walking away. So, Amelia did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran. But Ethan didn't give up so easily. At first, he gave her space, respecting her need for distance. He let her have time to process, to come to terms with whatever this was between them. He trusted that she would eventually come to him, that the connection they shared was strong enough to withstand the forces pulling them apart. But when the days stretched into weeks, and Amelia still refused to let him in, still kept him at arm's length, he knew he had to do something. So, he stopped chasing her. And instead, he simply showed up. Not in a grand, dramatic way, not with declarations of undying love or extravagant gestures. But in small moments, in quiet acts of kindness, and subtle displays of support. He would occasionally drop by the bookstore where she worked, pretending to browse the shelves, striking up casual conversations about her favorite authors, recommending new releases he thought she might enjoy. He would sit in his usual spot at the cafe, a quiet presence in her periphery, never pushing, never demanding, just being there, a constant reminder that he hadn't forgotten her. And slowly, painstakingly, it worked. Amelia stopped actively avoiding him, her initial defensiveness gradually eroding under the constant barrage of his gentle persistence. She stopped making excuses, started engaging in their conversations, her initial nervousness giving way to a tentative sense of ease. And one day, she even found herself laughing at something he said, a real, genuine laugh that bubbled up from deep within her, a sound she hadn't realized she had been holding back. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan saw a crack in her walls, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as impossible as she thought. But just as Amelia was starting to feel comfortable, starting to think that maybe this wasn't a mistake, that maybe something real could blossom between them, something happened that changed everything. It was late. She had stayed at work later than usual, helping a customer find a rare first edition. Her head was pounding, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't been feeling well all day, a nagging fatigue that had settled deep in her bones. But she pushed through it, telling herself it was just a little stress, that she would be fine once she got home, that she just needed some rest. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the cool night air, the world tilted. Her vision blurred, the streetlights swirling into hazy halos. Her knees buckled, her body betraying her. And then, everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was somewhere warm, somewhere soft. She lay on a cloud of crisp, white sheets, the gentle fabric caressing her skin. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled the silence, a rhythmic pulse that anchored her to reality. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes, her lids heavy. And the first thing she saw, the last person she expected to see, was Ethan. He was sitting beside her bed in the sterile hospital room, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, his face drawn with worry, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had been running his hands through it in agitation. The moment he saw her awake, his breath hitched. A wave of relief flooded his features, erasing the worry lines that had etched themselves onto his face. "Amelia," he murmured, his voice low and raw with emotion. "You scared the hell out of me." Her throat was dry, her voice a raspy whisper. What happened?" He leaned in slightly, his brow furrowed with concern. "You collapsed on the street," he said, his voice tight, his words clipped. "A passerby called an ambulance. When I found out you were here, He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "I came as fast as I could." Amelia blinked slowly, her mind still struggling to process his words. He came for her. He had dropped everything, abandoned his responsibilities, just to be here, by her side. And suddenly, all the walls she had built, all the reasons she had convinced herself to stay away from him, all the doubts and insecurities that had plagued her for so long, they didn't matter anymore. Amelia woke up to the soft glow of hospital lights and the distant murmur of voices outside the room. Her body felt heavy, her limbs weak, but it was the warmth beside her that made her turn her head. And that was when she saw him. Ethan, sitting next to her bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, his usually sharp, confident features drawn with exhaustion and concern, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had been running his hands through it. The moment her eyes fluttered open, he exhaled sharply, relief flooding his face. "Amelia," his voice was low, raw, "you scared the hell out of me." Amelia blinked slowly, her mind still catching up. What happened?" Her throat was dry, her voice weak. Ethan leaned in slightly, as if needing to be closer. "You collapsed on the street," his fingers curled into a fist. "You had a high fever, you were dehydrated, exhausted. Pushing yourself too hard." Amelia swallowed, trying to sit up, but he was immediately there, his hand steadying her, supporting her. And for the first time, she saw it, not pity, not responsibility, but something else entirely, something gentle, intense, unwavering, genuine care. Her chest tightened painfully. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't look at her like that. Because if he did, she might start to believe it. She might start to believe that someone like him, someone who had everything, could want someone like her. And she couldn't afford that kind of heartbreak. So, she did what she always did. She pushed him away. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's brows furrowed. "What?" Amelia forced herself to look away, her gaze fixed on the sterile white sheets. "You don't have to do this." His jaw clenched. "Do what?" He gestured weakly around the room. "Taking care of me, sitting here all night, acting like I matter." Ethan's entire body went still. And then, his expression darkened, his eyes flashing with something she had never seen before. "So," he said, his voice suddenly low and sharp, "you think I'm here out of obligation?" She opened her mouth to deny it, but then closed it again. Because yes, that's exactly what she thought. And that thought terrified her. She didn't want to be his burden. She didn't want to be the girl he felt sorry for. So, she forced herself to say it, to voice the fear that had been gnawing at her from the beginning. "I don't need your charity, Ethan." His eyes flashed with something she had never seen before, frustration, anger, something deeper, something almost wounded. "This isn't charity, Amelia," he said, his voice tight, his words laced with a barely suppressed fury. "This is me caring about you." She let out a short, breathless laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. "Why, Ethan? Why?" His fingers curled at his sides, his knuckles white. "What do you mean, why?" "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of vulnerability and defiance. "You have everything. Money, success, women who would do anything to be with you." Her throat tightened, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "So why are you here?" His breath hitched, caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. And then, he finally said it, the words tumbling out of him like a confession. "Because I like you, Amelia." Amelia's heart stopped. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, impossible to ignore. But before she could even process it, before she could let herself believe it, the fear took over again, that familiar wave of self-doubt crashing over her. She shook her head, her fingers gripping the hospital blanket so tightly that her knuckles ached. "No," she said, her voice barely holding together, cracking under the weight of her insecurities. "That doesn't make sense." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers. "Why not?" Amelia swallowed hard, her chest aching, her voice a fragile whisper. "Because you have everything, and I have nothing." Her voice trembled, a desperate plea for him to understand. "How am I supposed to believe that you need me?" Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Ethan's gaze never wavered. And for the first time, Amelia saw something broken in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, something that mirrored the pain she had been carrying inside for so long. And she realized, with a jolt of clarity, that maybe she wasn't the only one who was scared. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists before he slowly released them. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at her, his blue eyes searching, conflicted, almost vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. And then, he spoke, his voice low and steady, but laced with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. "You think I have everything?" he murmured, the question hanging in the air. "That my life is perfect, that I don't know what it feels like to be not enough?" Amelia frowned, her throat tight, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the confident, successful Ethan Hayes with the vulnerable man standing before her. "Isn't it?" Ethan let out a short breath, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a weariness that belied his age. "No, Amelia," he said, his tone sharper now, more insistent. "It's not." She stared at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. She had always seen Ethan as someone untouchable, someone who had everything. But now, for the first time, she was seeing something else, something broken, something real. "I wasn't always like this," Ethan continued, rubbing his hands together absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't grow up rich. My parents worked hard, but we struggled. I put myself through mid-school with scholarships and part-time jobs, working myself to the bone to get where I am." Amelia held her breath, watching as he spoke, not with his usual confidence, but with a quiet honesty that made her heart ache. "When I finally became a doctor, when I started making real money, I thought I'd made it," he said, his voice dropping lower, his words tinged with a hint of bitterness. "I thought, this is it. I've done everything right." His voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. "And then I met someone." Amelia's stomach twisted, a familiar knot of jealousy tightening in her gut. She knew where this was going, she could feel it in her bones. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from whispering the question that burned on her tongue. "What happened?" Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "She didn't love me," he said, his voice soft, but sharp. "She loved my money." Amelia felt her chest tighten painfully, her insecurities echoing his words. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I found out she had been seeing someone else behind my back, that everything she said to me, everything we had, was just an act. A carefully constructed performance designed to exploit my wealth and my vulnerability." Amelia sucked in a sharp breath, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't know what to say, her mind reeling from the revelation. Because this was not the Ethan Hayes she had imagined. This was not the perfect, confident doctor, the untouchable millionaire. This was a man who had been betrayed, hurt, left with scars that no one else could see, just like her. "I haven't let anyone in since then," Ethan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck, his gaze averted. "I tell myself I don't need to, that it's easier this way, to keep everyone at arm's length and protect myself from getting hurt again." He looked up at her then, his gaze burning into hers, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made her breath catch. But then, I met you. Amelia froze, her heart stopped, and suddenly, everything else disappeared, the hospital, the past, the fear. It was just him and her, and the unspoken truth that had been simmering between them since that first, awkward appointment. Amelia swallowed, trying to find her voice, but her throat was too tight, her emotions too raw. Ethan. He shook his head, cutting her off, his gaze intense. No, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. Let me finish. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his presence filling her senses, making her head spin. Amelia's throat tightened, her hands clammy. Ethan took another step, and now he was right in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating off him, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. I don't care what you have, or don't have, he said, his voice raw with emotion, his words a passionate whisper that vibrated through her. I don't care that you don't come from money, that your life is different than mine, that you think you're not enough. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative, hesitant, almost like he was giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't break their gaze. All I care about, he murmured, his eyes searching hers, pleading for understanding, is you. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. The soft hum of the night filled the silence between them, a quiet symphony of urban life that faded into insignificance. And then, Ethan cupped her face, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbones, tilting her chin up until their eyes met, their souls connecting in a silent, unspoken understanding. I want you, Amelia, he whispered, his voice barely audible, his words a fragile prayer. Just you. Amelia's breath hitched, her heart soaring with a mixture of joy and terror. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. She let herself believe that someone like Ethan, someone who could have anyone, anything, could want her, could love her, just for who she was. Amelia lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the events of the evening. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, soft but unshakable, a constant reminder of the possibility that lay before her. I want you, Amelia. Just you. She had spent so long believing she wasn't enough, that she was too ordinary, too flawed, that love wasn't meant for someone like her. And yet, Ethan had chosen her anyway, had seen something in her that she couldn't see in herself. But could she do it? Could she let herself believe in this? Could she trust that he wouldn't eventually realize he had made a mistake, that she wasn't the right person for him? Could she risk opening her heart again, knowing that it could be shattered into a million pieces? The next few days were a blur of indecision. Amelia avoided calling him, avoided making a decision, her mind paralyzed by fear. She knew that she couldn't keep running forever, that eventually she would have to face him, to confront her insecurities, to choose whether or not to take a leap of faith. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Because the truth was, when she imagined her life without Ethan in it, it felt empty, cold, like something was missing. Like he was missing. And that terrified her even more than the idea of falling for him. Ethan, on the other hand, waited patiently, respecting her need for space, trusting that she would eventually come to him, knowing that the decision had to be hers. He didn't push, didn't demand an answer, didn't try to force her into something she wasn't ready for. He knew Amelia, he knew that she needed time to process, to work through her fears, to come to her conclusion. And as much as it killed him to wait, he was willing to give her that. Because if it meant having her in the end, if it meant spending the rest of his life with her, she was worth the wait. She was worth any price. But Amelia couldn't run forever. The moment it happened,